Every day, we pick the storylines that we think are overplayed or underplayed in the news. Now, our underplayed story today comes from the great state of Texas, which is at the center of a growing political showdown over voter rights. Last week, the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against the state to block its new voter ID law. Now, that law would tighten restrictions on what kind of identification voters would need to show at the polls. Democrats say it discriminates against minority voters who are less likely to have those sorts of IDs. This is the Obama administration's second attempt at stopping Texas's voter ID law and the first since the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act back in June. Now, voting rights are a huge issue, but our underplayed part of the story is the battle between a Democratic White House and the largest Republican state in the country. Joining us to talk about it is Ross Ramsey, the executive editor at the Texas Tribune. He joins us now via Skype. Hey, Ross.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Great. So, Ross, Chris and I were talking about earlier what a interesting dynamic this is, a Democratic administration versus red state Texas. What's at stake here?
Well, this plays out a political fight that started in the Texas legislature. The legislature in 2011 redrew its redistricting maps. That went to court. They did this voter ID law, and that went to court. And it positioned the state against the federal government on one hand. It positioned the Republicans against the Democrats on another hand. So it's sort of a political and legal fight that runs in parallel, and in a weird way sort of benefits both sides. Both sides want to be in this fight.
Ross, great point. It's a win-win in some ways. But, I talked to folks up here in D.C. who say they were not stunned that Eric Holder and the Obama administration pursued this, the protesting the law, but a little bit because they were surprised at it might not be a winner. This might not be a sure thing for Eric Holder and the Obama administration. What's the reception down there in Texas, particularly among Texas Democrats?
Well, I think, the first thing here is that the Republicans act surprised. They weren't particularly surprised. If you were, hanging around the redistricting trials where there's, 6 billion lawyers, they were all sort of expecting when the feds come back at us or when the Democrats come back at us, this Section 2, Section 5 thing is where they're going to come back at us. The Democrats down here are, I guess, happy that the Obama administration has been as bold as it has. This was, it's an administration that sometimes is seen as timid down here, and actually came in and made a fist. And whether they win or not, it's a fight that these guys want to have. And the longer fight here is a fight over Hispanic voters. And if you're fighting over Hispanic voters and the frame is set up like the Holder administration, like Holder and the Obama administration want to set it up, it's we're fighting for minorities, they're fighting against minorities, discuss.
Yeah. So, Ross, some have suggested that this is kind of a warning to states like North Carolina, which just signed its voter ID law earlier this month. Where do we go from here? Well, the argument here is that these states, in particular Texas here, has a history of racial discrimination. They've said this in the redistricting briefs that they filed. They said it in a voter ID lawsuit that Texas has this long-standing history of voter discrimination, and that only with federal intervention will Texas, give these voters their franchise. And so they want to weigh into this fight, and they want to weigh in a kind of a muscular way. The arguments are consistent in both of the suits, and it parallels, the legal argument parallels the political argument. And so if you win the legal argument, you've helped these voters out. If you lose the legal argument, you might win the political argument anyway. So the Texas Democrats love this. Well,
Russ, one last thing before we go. Texas has an early filing deadline for 2014 races. Do we have any sense on how this plays out? Because it has obvious repercussions on elections next year.
Right. So the first track here is whether they can get redistricting maps approved and in place so that they don't have to delay the primaries as they did in 2012. That's kind of up in the air. Filing would ordinarily start in December, and we'd have primaries in March. In 2012, we had the primaries in May. Everything got delayed. The other question is whether they can implement this voter ID law and vote with it or without it, and that's all the difference in the world. Do you have to show a photo ID or not?
Ross Ramsey, the Texas Tribune, thanks for your time. Texas is never boring.
It never is.
Thank you, sir. And that is the latest in what is a growing electoral political battle. This is going to keep going, as Ross said. We're going to see this have implications to 2013, 2014, maybe even beyond. We'll be following all of it quite closely.